What if Nicolás Maduro was gone tomorrow? Imagine he's no longer in power. The battle for Venezuela's future would have just begun. And it's a war that wouldn't be fought with bullets, but with two resources. One promises a corporate-led rebirth, backed by the world's biggest players. The other fuels a shadow economy of gangs and smugglers, threatening to create a permanent mafia state. This is the story of oil versus gold, and the one that wins will decide not just Venezuela's financial destiny, but its very soul. Section 1. Autopsy of a Collapse. Before we can understand where Venezuela is going, we have to grasp the sheer scale of the wreckage. Any post-Maduro scenario has to start here, in a nation in ruins. The system he oversaw left the deepest scars of any nation in modern Western history, not defeated in a major war. Between 2013 and 2021, Venezuela's GDP shrank by an almost unbelievable 75%. To put that in perspective, picture the American economy today. Now imagine if 3/4 of it just vanished. Poof! All the jobs, the production, the services gone. That's what Venezuelans have lived through. It's the largest peacetime economic collapse in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. The nation suffered a period of hyperinflation that saw prices rise by an estimated 130,000% in 2018 alone. This economic apocalypse plunged a majority of the population into poverty and triggered a refugee crisis that has seen nearly 8 million people flee the country, creating instability across the entire continent. This collapse created what can only be described as two Venezuelas. The first is the official state, a hollowed-out shell of what it once was, a nation with broken institutions and a starving population. But beneath that lies the second Venezuela, a sprawling, lawless, and brutally innovative shadow economy. This is a world that runs on dollars and crypto, on smuggled goods and illicit services. It was born from the desperation of the state's failure, and it evolved into a sophisticated criminal ecosystem. It's this second Venezuela, the one that thrived in the darkness, that now presents the greatest challenge to a stable future. The criminal networks nurtured under the regime are deeply entrenched, controlling territory, people, and vast, dark wealth. And that brings us to the central conflict for the nation's future. The battle is between two vastly different sources of wealth, each representing a distinct path forward. On one side, there is oil, the resource that built modern Venezuela and promises a structured, corporate-led recovery. On the other, gold, the untraceable, lawless resource that fuels the shadow economy and threatens to lock the country into a future as a permanent narco state. The winner of this contest will not just determine the nation's financial destiny, but its very identity for generations to come. Section 2. The Oil Promise. A Corporate Rebirth. On paper, the case for oil looks like a slam dunk. It's the story of a fallen giant poised for a comeback. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, an estimated 303 billion barrels. That's nearly 20% of the entire global supply, more oil than Saudi Arabia. At its peak in the late 1990s, the country was an energy superpower, pumping out over 3 million barrels of crude oil per day. Today, that output has dwindled to a fraction, hovering around 1.1 million barrels daily as of late 2025. The promise is that with a new government and U.S. sanctions lifted, the floodgates of foreign investment could reopen. The world's energy giants are circling. In any post-Maduro scenario, you can bet Wall Street would react positively. We'd likely see interest from energy companies with a stake in Venezuela's future, especially from U.S. refiners whose Gulf Coast facilities are perfectly configured to process Venezuela's signature heavy crude. Chevron, having bravely maintained a foothold in the country, is positioned as a potential leader in this revival. The vision being sold is one of rapid revival, bringing desperately needed cash into a transitional government's coffers and creating thousands of formal sector jobs. But this shimmering promise masks a brutal and expensive reality. The idea that Venezuela can simply flip a switch is a dangerous fantasy. The country's oil infrastructure isn't just neglected, it's a fossilized relic. Pipelines are corroded, refineries are crippled, and the industry has been hollowed out, not just of capital, but of the skilled engineers who fled the country. To even begin to fix this, the investment required is monumental. Experts estimate that restoring Venezuela's oil sector to its former glory would require over $100 billion and could take the better part of a decade. More sober analysts project a much slower recovery. They suggest that even with a stable political transition, reaching 1.3 to 1.4 million barrels per day within 2 years is a more realistic goal. Pushing beyond 2 million barrels per day remains a distant dream, unlikely before the end of the decade without massive, sustained investment. And here's the risk. International oil companies aren't charities. They were burned once before when Hugo Chavez nationalized their assets in 2007. They will demand ironclad legal protections before committing billions. This creates a potential future where Venezuela rebuilds its oil sector, only to see the lion's share of the profits flow out of the country, repeating the cycle of resource dependency that has plagued it for a century. The oil promise is real, but it is fraught with peril. Section 3. The gold reality. A shadow future. If oil is the formal path to recovery, gold is its dark twin, a chaotic, violent, and criminalized path that could consume Venezuela's future. While the world focused on the collapse of the oil industry, another resource was being exploited in the shadows, creating a parallel economy of immense power and brutality. This shadow economy is centered on a vast, lawless territory in the south known as the Orinoco Mining Arc. Established by presidential decree in 2016, this zone covers a staggering 112,000 square kilometers, an area larger than Portugal, making up 12% of Venezuela's landmass. The regime claimed it would be a source of legitimate revenue. Instead, it became a hub for one of the largest illicit mining operations on Earth. An estimated 70 to 86% of the gold extracted from Venezuela is produced illegally. This isn't small-scale panning. It's industrial-scale plunder. The landscape is scarred with open-pit mines that have leveled thousands of hectares of pristine rainforest, much of it in supposedly protected national parks. The mining process relies on the widespread use of mercury, which has poisoned entire river basins. In some regions, studies have found over 90% of indigenous women with dangerously high levels of mercury in their bodies, a toxin that causes devastating neurological damage and birth defects. The human cost is just as horrific. The mining arc isn't governed by the state. It's ruled by a patchwork of violent actors. These include criminal syndicates, known as PRAIN's dissident Colombian guerrilla fighters like the ELN, and elements of the Venezuelan military itself, operating under the umbrella of the so-called Cartel de las Soles. These groups act as the sole authority, enforcing their will through terror. The mines are worked by an estimated 500,000 people, many coerced into labor. Child labor is rampant, and workers are subjected to beatings and summary execution. This ecosystem of crime and violence has created a self-sustaining financial machine. The illicit gold, worth billions, is smuggled out of the country through clandestine routes to be laundered abroad. This trade is completely untraceable, operating outside the global financial system. It provided a vital lifeline for the Maduro regime to bypass international sanctions. Now, it serves as the war chest for the criminal networks he empowered. This is the shadow future that haunts Venezuela. Section 4. The Winner's Prize. Two National Destinies. So, the contest between oil and gold is a battle for the very soul of Venezuela. The resource that becomes the dominant economic engine will define the country for the next century. These aren't just two economic models. They are two fundamentally different visions of what Venezuela can become. First, let's imagine a future where oil wins. In this scenario, a transitional government with strong international backing successfully attracts the massive investment needed to rebuild its energy sector. Companies like Chevron, and perhaps even returning players like Exxon and ConocoPhillips, bring in capital and technology, slowly restoring production. The process is gradual, But within 5 to 7 years, Venezuela could once again be a significant player, producing 2 million barrels per day or more. The effects would be transformative. Billions in oil revenue would flow into state coffers, funding the reconstruction of schools and hospitals. A formal economy would be reborn, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs and pulling millions out of poverty. But this future is not without risk. Venezuela could get caught in the same resource curse that led to its collapse over reliance on one commodity, vulnerable to price swings, and a political class susceptible to corruption. Now, let's imagine the alternative. A future where gold wins. In this darker scenario, a transitional government proves too weak or corrupt to assert its authority. The political stability required to attract $100 billion of oil investment never materializes. The oil sector stagnates. Into this power vacuum, the shadow economy metastasizes. The criminal networks controlling the Orinoco mining arc consolidate their power, their illicit gold wealth, giving them more influence than the official government. This criminal state would be an epicenter of regional instability, a hub for narco-trafficking, weapons smuggling, and money laundering. For the average Venezuelan, life would be governed not by law, but by the whim of brutal gang leaders. Violence would be endemic. The environment would continue to be ravaged. Venezuela wouldn't recover. It would simply transition from a dictatorship to a full-blown mafia state. Any change in leadership would not be the final chapter in Venezuela's story. It would merely be the end of the preface. The real battle, the one that will truly define the nation, is a structural conflict between two powerful economic forces. One offers a path toward a conventional, corporate, and globally integrated future, a path paved with oil. The other offers a descent into a lawless, criminalized, and isolated future, a path paved with gold. The world is watching, not just to see if a nation can come back from the dead, but to see which version of itself it chooses to become. The stakes could not be higher, and the outcome is far from certain. The fight for Venezuela's soul is just beginning. This is a story that will continue to evolve. To follow our ongoing analysis of this critical situation and understand how global events are shaping your world, make sure you subscribe to our channel.